Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad that you came to the call for this panel, this presentation by Professor Wilson. I'd like to say a few words about her because this is not the first time she comes to AUB. She came here as an evaluator for the Master of Science in Energy Studies program in December 2013. She spent 2 or 3 days and left. And then now 5 years later, she's coming today, she's talking to the students in the program, she's seeing how the whole interaction and community that works in energy and connects energy to planning to environment is working at AUB in all aspects. So I just want to say, read your biography or part of it, and then I'll give you the floor to sort of listen to it, about your experiences in this area. So Dr. Elizabeth Wilson is the inaugural director of the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society and professor in the Environmental Studies Department at Dartmouth College. She studies how energy systems are changing in the face of new technologies and new societal pressures. Her work focuses on the implementation of energy and environmental policies and laws in practice. She's interested in how institutions support and thwart energy system transitions and focuses on the interplay between technology innovation, policy creation, and institutional decision-making. It's still a maze for me how this decision-making takes place anywhere, but it's fine. Dr. Wilson was a professor at the University of Minnesota and was awarded a 2000 Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, where she spent 2016-17 academic year at the Nadesh Technical University. She was selected as a 2014-15 CIC Academic Leadership Fellow. She was chosen as Leopold Leadership Fellow in 2011. She spent 2 years in China as 2 academic years as a visiting professor at Senegal University in Beijing, right? Over there, she was supported by the McKnight Land Grant Professorship. Prior to joining the University of Minnesota, she worked with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and before that, Wilson worked in Belgium, Brunei, and Tanzania. Wow. She holds doctorate in engineering and public policy from Carnegie Mellon University. I could see how interdisciplinary the experiences are, and that's why you fit very well at the time to evaluate the energy studies program and guide us in how to make changes. You guided us how to make changes then to have this program survive. So I'd like to give you the floor, and we'll be happy to listen to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really want to thank you all for the warm welcome back here at AUB. It's such a pleasure to be here and to really see the program happening in practice. When the job at Dartmouth came up 2 years ago, it was to lead and develop a new program on energy and society. And for me, it was the and society piece that was the most interesting part of the equation. There's lots of organizations, lots of universities that focus on technologies and solutions. But oftentimes we do so without really thinking about the contexts, the people, or the critical needs that energy plays in our societies. And what I think is so interesting is just remembering how central energy is to the human endeavor. Without energy, we die. And our energy systems are really at a point of fragility. This is actually a picture of the background from the wildfires in California, where I originally come from. We're in a world with a rapidly changing climate. We're in a world with shifting geopolitical risks. We're in a world where we have new risks facing our energy system, and where we have the hurricanes or the big storms and cyclones in Malawi and Mozambique affecting the power supply and delivery in South Africa. where they're having severe power cuts that are affecting the entire country. In the US right now, we have severe flooding in the Midwest of the country, where frozen ground and warm rain have led to historic levels of crop destruction, transportation infrastructure destruction. So we're thinking about how do we create affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy systems in a global context that is shifting more rapidly than any of our planning ever really imagined. I think it's really instructive to recognize how important the technologies are, of course, the policies are, of course, but really importantly, the contexts. One of the really interesting things I think about AUB is you have a very unique perspective about the role of energy, not only in Lebanon, but around the world. So there's theory and there's practice. Only in theory are they the same. Practice, of course, is much more complicated. And so when we think about the ideals of how our technologies, how our policies, and how our markets will work, what we appreciate in practice is they very rarely work as smoothly as we imagine they will. And I think one of the really nice things about seeing energy systems all around the world and seeing how they're being developed and changing and deployed really allows for the appreciation not only of the technical skill of the participants involved, but also the very different institutional shapes that affect how energy decisions are happening in practice. So one of the pieces that I think is interesting is not only the investments in technologies that are required to create sustainable low-carbon energy systems. If we're serious about climate change, there's a story of mitigating the emissions, but also one of adapting our energy systems to a rapidly changing world. And the IEA, is this true? The IEA estimates that we're looking at global investments. Look at this. Yay. The main point being that looking at investments of about $43 trillion by 2035. And so when we're thinking about how central energy is to our society, we're thinking about without energy, people die. Hurricane Maria that wiped out the electric grid in Puerto Rico a year and a half ago ended up killing around 3,500 people. And it was really where energy intersected with healthcare. You couldn't keep your insulin cold. You couldn't get your respirator to work. You couldn't get your dialysis at the hospital. People couldn't call 911. The hospital itself lost an MRI because with the nitrogen, it couldn't keep the MRI cool. And so we're really thinking about energy embedded in all of our societies to provide basic services, education, transportation, healthcare. And so when I think of the risks facing the energy system from extreme weather events like the one affecting the South African grid and killing all of the people in southeastern Africa, or the flooding in the Midwest, really we're at an important inflection point for how we're thinking about energy systems going forward. And in a lot of parts of the world, there's a huge investment in renewable energy technologies. And you've seen changes in how energy systems are planned, how they operate, what technologies are being deployed, and billions of dollars of new investments. I particularly liked this photo because it highlights the traditional windmill that was used in the American West, that was used in the Europe in the Middle Ages, that was used in the Arab world from 600 or 900 to pump water, to grind grains, that's now being used to produce electricity around the world. And so creating a carbon-free energy system, the International Energy Agency estimates will cost roughly $48 trillion. That's $2.3 trillion a year for the next 20 years of investment. But I really don't like to present the numbers that way because I think it really misses how energy investment, how energy deployment takes place in different places at different times with different sorts of risks, with different kinds of opportunities. Investing in the Democratic Republic of Congo is not like investing in Djibouti, is not like investing in Denmark. And so that context that involves the culture, the people, the institutions, the policies, all come together to shape our energy futures in different ways. But yet at universities, I think we're often guilty of thinking about the economics, of thinking about what is being deployed where, of thinking about specifically the technologies and what types of technologies are happening in different parts of the world, without necessarily thinking about the contexts. And if we think about the whole world, there's about 2 billion people that have too much energy. I would say these are the rich people in many parts of the world, or probably Europe and North America. And we spend a lot of time talking about the 1.1 billion people that don't have access to any electricity. But I think the really interesting story over the next 30 years is happening in the middle. The 4 billion people that don't have enough energy, that are creating energy systems to meet demand, but they don't quite yet have enough. My graduate student from Kathmandu showed me a map. He's from Nepal, and he showed me a map of the city that tells you what hours of the day you have power depending on where you live. I learned here that you also are managing energy in different ways with the informal power sector and the traditional power sector, and that really it's these 4 billion people in the world that are going to be driving global demand in the next 30 years, and also really are coming up with some of the most creative solutions of what to do when you don't have enough. And we've spent a little bit of time, talking about how do you think about energy systems? How do you teach about energy systems when so much of the idea of how they operate is based from the people that have too much? Or we think about investing in charities to supply energy for the people that have nothing. But really these 4 billion people who are driving global demand, I think are the most interesting story on the planet, both from a resilience perspective, from an investment perspective, but also from an innovation perspective. And so oftentimes thinking about transforming the energy system and thinking about the needs for adaptation, for reliability, for cybersecurity, it's incredibly daunting. And sometimes I only get my hope from thinking about where we've been really wrong about thinking about energy system transformation in the past. And so I'm going to give you a little quiz. Every year, the U.S. Department of Energy puts out the annual energy outlook, and that projects what the energy mix will be over the next 20 years. They run the National Energy Modeling Study, and they project that from today, from 20 years from now, what that energy mix will look like, what the projected demand will be, to use as a tool for energy planning, for thinking about how energy systems can and will change going into the future. So in 2000, this is a quiz and you can raise your hand, the annual energy outlook projected how much wind there would be in 2020. Now, as a spoiler alert, there's roughly 96,000 megawatts of wind on the US system today. So, in 2000 annual energy outlook, did they project that there would be 800 megawatts of new wind power, 8,000 megawatts of new wind power, or 80,000 megawatts of new wind power? Okay, who votes A? Who votes 800? Okay, I've got 1, 2. Who votes 8,000? Okay, about a third of you. Who votes 80,000? Okay, these people believe in the annual energy outlook. I mean, we're the energy experts, right? Like your colleagues, your professors, other people that do these analyses. It was A. We, the experts, were wrong by 2 orders of magnitude. And we were wrong, and badly wrong, not only in how much energy would be produced, but also on the constraints that we put on the wind turbine industry, that we put on how electrical grids operated, that we put on how wind would or wouldn't be integrated into electricity system markets. And for me, what this story helps to illustrate is how changes in energy systems, changes in energy markets, changing in weather prediction, changing in control systems, changing in market rules, have co-evolved dynamically to allow for a development and level of wind penetration that was never imagined by the experts in the room. So maybe being wrong, well, actually, that's not true. The only people that got this right, like the two gentlemen in the room, was actually Greenpeace. But they got it right for the wrong reasons. So that, as all professors know, is not really getting it right. You don't get full credit for the answer if you didn't show your work and do it right, right? And so when we look at the map of the US with strong wind resources, onshore and offshore, and when we look at the map of the installed wind power capacity, like I said today, over 96,000 megawatts, with this year projected to be one of the strongest years ever, in part driven by state policies, in part driven by the federal production tax credit, in part driven by the global innovation system that has made wind production an enterprise that affects not only the US, but China, India, European countries. Wind production is a global enterprise, and one that it's also spurred lots of local economic development as well. I think it's important to appreciate that the evolution and revolution of these technologies is a lot of hard work. And it's a lot of people that we never expect. I think we often like to talk about the technologies without necessarily thinking about all of the small tweaks in regional transmission, wind procurement standards, or operating standards of the grid that really are the ones that allow the technologies to flourish as they do, or don't in some locations. And now in the US, we have, these are the first 5 offshore turbines that are being built off of Rhode Island and on Block Island. And those of you who follow the wind industry appreciate that the North Sea and the Baltic Sea are much further ahead, where they've been investing in offshore wind for a long time. And so we'll see where this goes. But I think it's an interesting illustrative case of how we, the experts, didn't get that you could have a global industry that would spur technology development. We didn't appreciate that wind could produce and provide a greater percentage of the grid. We didn't appreciate control systems that would be able to let the grid operator dispatch down or bring up remotely. We didn't appreciate increases in global weather monitoring systems that would allow for wind projection and following errors to be more accurately mapped. And so really thinking about the technology ecosystems that develop are so much more than just the technology in place. And so when we think about energy technologies, every year the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab puts out this great Sankey diagram. Did you guys study this one? Did you have one for your classes here where you follow different countries? They have these for all over the world, where you have the different sources of energy over here, the different sectors that are using over here, the fact that about 40% goes into useful energy, while most energy that we use is still wasted. That's a great opportunity. And then how these different energy sources kind of snake through society. And we often look at these maps of sources, of sinks, of sectors, without really thinking about all of the institutions, all of the people, all of the specific laws and regulations that are embedded in how energy flows across society. And so I think we're pretty good at thinking about what we need to do, at thinking about who needs to do it, And in the US, there's a level of actors that range from the federal level to the regional levels with regional transmission organizations, to the utilities that are in charge of generation, utilities in charge of transmission, utilities in charge of distribution, the regulators that are active at the federal level, at the state level, oftentimes communities as well, at the customers across the industrial, commercial, residential area, the federal level Energy Regulatory Commission. We also often have the courts if it's a contested matter. And then, of course, there's the civil society stakeholders that are involved in various ways across the system. But I think one of the pieces that is particularly interesting to explore further is really thinking about not only the what and the who, but really the how. How do we create enduring institutional solutions that allow not only for the building of technologies, but also the long-term operation, the integration into our systems, where we can really get the full value of them? The world is littered with well-meaning projects that last for a few years and then break down. No one comes to repair them, or we patch them together in ways that don't work together. And we think about the how oftentimes from a policy space. In the US in the late 90s, we were really focused on restructuring, this idea of breaking apart the centralized utilities so generation was owned. The green ones are the places that have restructured where generation is owned separately from distribution or transmission lines. So 19 states in the US have restructured their states in some sort of ways. We often spend a lot of time talking about the investor-owned utilities, which are often regulated at the state level. So the idea that I'll give you an exclusive service territory, and then you'll be rate regulated with a certain rate of return. But the model of energy system ownership in the U.S. is also shaped by our regional transmission organizations, these voluntary electricity markets. We were talking about lunch today over the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT. And these RTOs operate much like utilities, but over larger areas to deal with high voltage transmission planning, to deal with how markets work in their service territories, and to really think also about the question of reliability, and are another kind of quasi decision-making body that shapes how utilities themselves work. And so today I'd like to spend a little bit of time thinking about a utility that we don't often talk about, but one that I think provides a really interesting model for thinking about places where markets may not make sense. The 4 billion people in the middle, where it may not be economic to be thinking about it. And in the US, we have 3 types of utilities. We have rural electric cooperatives, municipal utilities, and the investor-owned utilities. And so with the investor-owned utilities, or IOUs, this is the model that we most often talk about, where we assume an investor, privately held, that will be earning a certain rate of return. Of interest, I think, are the cooperative utilities and the municipal utilities that are a consumer-owned model, where the people of the city own the utility, operate the utility, invest in the utility, where the people in the rural electric cooperative service territory are responsible for this as well. And understanding how these 2 sets of institutions came apart, I think provide a broader idea of the types of institutions which could be flexible and important for thinking about energy systems not only in the US, but in other parts of the world as well. And these organizations, while they sell today co-ops about 10%, munis about 12% of US electricity sales, they actually cover roughly 70% of the US land area. And one of the things that I think is useful to remember is how these organizations were created. A research project that I've been working on with some colleagues at University of Minnesota and Boise State has tried to understand how distributed energy resources are supported or not in these consumer-owned utilities. They have a different set of financing mechanisms. They have a different set of decision-making capabilities. And when we're thinking about how they are adopting in some places more aggressively than any investor-owned utilities, or how they're stopping distributed renewable resources, we ended up with a really interesting tapestry of decisions. But one of the things that struck me as we started to study these organizations is just how controversial, in particular the rural electric co-ops were at the start. This is a poster from a play from 1937 called Power. This was the Depression of the US, and the federal government paid the Federal Theater Project to create a play about the creation of public power. Now, what people don't appreciate is 100 years ago, less than 100 years ago, most of the cities in the US had access to electricity, but only 10% of the farms did. And if you wanted power on your farm, you had to buy the poles, you had to buy the wires, you had to dig the holes. And at that time, 10% of US farms had access to electricity. 10%. And the cause of rural poverty was becoming important and political. We had the Dust Bowl that displaced many people. And the progressives, the Republican progressives, came to power arguing that electrification of rural areas of America was an important piece of economic, rural, and cultural development. And so you had Senator George Norris, the Republican from Nebraska, who served in the House and the Senate, pushing for rural electrification. Again, these are the progressive Republicans who were driving this. And what I want to highlight here is that this was very controversial at the time. Politically, this was very hard. It's easy to look back on this period of US history and pretend that everyone agreed this was a good idea, but they didn't. And actually, the holding companies who owned the electricity supply found a grocer with the same name from Nebraska and put him on the ballot just to try and confuse people. But this idea that having energy, having electricity on the farm could allow for more development, could allow for a higher standard of living, really was the basis in the creation of rural electric cooperatives. And creating these cooperatives through the 1935 Rural Electrification Act allowed for cheap federal money that could underwrite the development and the purchase of lines and transmission lines. So a group would come together, each of you would give $25, become members of the co-op, and develop the rural electrification. And as I said before, this was not uncontroversial. When they were developing and actually the play that I mentioned earlier told the story of the Tennessee Valley Authority. At that time, in today's dollars, the cost of private power was roughly $2.36 per kilowatt hour. Here, I think with your private power, you pay about 25 cents a kilowatt hour, and with the state power, you're paying about 10. So $2.36 per kilowatt hour was the cost of private power. And the promise of public power was 50 cents a kilowatt hour, or 6 times less. So people wanted public power. The private service companies held the land, but they wouldn't develop it. It was too expensive to go to your farm, and you couldn't get a loan because you owed too much money on it. And So then when they said public power could come in and groups started to organize for the cooperatives and go forward, the private companies would oftentimes, and you'll still hear these stories told by the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, take over these territories at night. And the play is about, in part, the fight for public power. Here's the farmers chopping down the live lines because they wanted public power. And when you look at the map of the US today, what you appreciate is that over 70% of the country is still covered by rural electric cooperatives. These areas are hard to serve. They're sparsely populated. The population per mile and the cost per mile of service is very, very high. When we talk about market solutions, I think we often forget that it was public policy and the access to cheap capital that allowed most of the US to be developed and electrified. These organizations later then became the backbone of telephone and communication. And so when you're thinking about development, when you're thinking about supplying power, it really was this combination of public access to capital, and then innovation and the costs that brought the cost of electrification down. So this history is one that I think is interesting to explore. Whenever we've performed this play, and we've done it now about 3 times, just reading pieces of this play, I'm always old lady with shotgun. And you appreciate how something we look at today as relatively uncontroversial was at the time really hard. The Rural Electrification Act actually became part of a Supreme Court case in '38 because it was this idea that could private enterprise, if you had private enterprise active already, was the public government allowed to pass policies that took away private enterprise? So really, these places today that we look at as uncontroversial were not necessarily so. So I became interested in these organizations a few years ago with my colleagues because in theory, there's this idea that if a consumer owns, you already have energy democracy. You already have people making decisions to transform their energy systems in different ways. But what we were seeing in practice was huge variation in rural electric cooperatives and in municipal utilities, where some of these organizations were installing levels of solar, PV, wind energy at much higher levels than their investor-owned utility counterparts. And others were pretty much doing all that they could to stop any investment or any deployment of these technologies. And so through the McKnight Foundation, we were able to get a little bit of money to begin to understand how these utilities, which are often transmission-dependent utilities, were adapting and transitioning their organizations to accommodate the distributed energy resources that were coming online and being demanded by many of their customers. And Minnesota was a really interesting place for this, in part because public consumer-owned utilities sell about 40% of the resources and cover 80% of the state. And so locally, it's a very important type of organization. And when we started to look at the munis and co-ops, we ended up with kind of 4 emerging taxonomies of how they were treating the distributed energy resources coming online. Some of them were just monitoring and planning what was going on and not very actively involved. Others were trying to block them through re-engaging with their their generation utility. Others were working with their communities to try and figure out what their communities wanted and what would make sense for their different members. And others were thinking about how the distribution utility was going to be transformed in the face of low-cost distributed energy technologies. But the piece that I think was really interesting is that all of these organizations think about equality, think about how it affects their members and customers throughout in ways that the fairness and equity argument was really important. And the piece I hadn't appreciated before doing this study was how differently they viewed individual home rooftop solar versus a community solar project. If you wanted to do individual rooftop solar, you were costing the utility money and everybody was having to pay for your green habit. But if we invested collectively in a community solar solution, you were seen as making the utility stronger for the future. And just this small way that the distributed energy resources were configured really affected how rhetorically it played and how the investment strategy differed. And so while all of them are investing in the technologies, there was a huge variation in the context and the organization of how they went forward. And I think one of the pieces for me that was so interesting was thinking about where the opportunities from a policy perspective was for thinking about how to strengthen DER relationships within these organizations. I mentioned before the implications for fairness and how that was a really fundamental part of their orientation and policy design. They didn't have, like the investor-owned utilities, state legislation that could force them to do things. They're independent organizations. And so if you're a policymaker that wants them to do something, your tools of action have to be these informal learning networks or education. The other piece that was so interesting was how these organizations were often dependent on the generation of others, and they were locked into long-term contracts. And so if you want them to change, there's potentially a legal and contractual piece there that could think about how you would finance and reduce risk for different types of technologies. So this study is ongoing. Last week, my colleagues had a meeting with all of the co-ops and munis in Minnesota to kind of pull, again, their information out and start these conversations going forward. But, you know, as I have done in my thinking about not only the technologies, but also the who and the how, I'm constantly reminded that when we're thinking about energy globally, we're really thinking about a world that is 92% dependent on fossil fuels. And so this part right here is the non-carbon energy use in the world. And so if we're serious, this is from the BP Statistical Review of World Energy. So green is oil, red is natural gas, gray is coal. And so oftentimes as researchers and as students, it's really interesting to study and think about the renewable energy that's being invested in, that's growing rapidly. But I think we also need to do so with the realization of the context of how energy is produced in the world today, and the recognition that changing this energy system is actually one that will probably be very contested. And as we think about how these investments will happen in different organizations, in different parts of the world, I just want to link this idea of technologies, policies, but also theory and practice. And the context that drive the organizations, the context that drive the deployment, there's a lot of potential learning that's happening everywhere in the world. And so I think this is one of the most interesting areas to work on over the next couple decades, and it was so great to come here and meet so many students so committed to thinking about this problem, not only here, but around the world. So thank you very much. For the students, when we talked yesterday about that project in Syria, that was the artist group that was doing the wind installation in the hospital. I don't know if you're familiar with this or if you've heard about it before.
My name is Paulo Khayat. I'm studying mechanical engineering. I'm a third year. So we've been hearing a lot about smart grid systems, and I really want to know about what's the difference between a regular system and this smart, maybe automated that they're talking about. Thank you.
I think the smart grid space is really interesting to think about. And we had a book that we wrote a few years ago thinking about how smart grid meant something different to everybody. And there was kind of a general understanding that you'd have the normal electricity system with a communication information technology overlay. But how that's configured, who that service is, what it actually does, is again pretty variable. And there was a lot of effort to install advanced meter reading. There were some places where you had advanced meter infrastructure that was two-way and could control. But what the promise was to the consumer really varied by where it was developed and how it was developed. So I know that DOE has changed their language from the Department of Energy in the US from talking about smart grid to grid modernization. And they oftentimes really wrap in this idea of cybersecurity. They wrap in this idea of renewables development and being able to island. But depending on where you are, it's really, have you heard about that parable of the blind man and the elephant? Where, you know, depending on where you're sitting on the elephant, oh, it's like a big wall. Oh, it's like a tree trunk. Oh, it's like a snake. That often is kind of how smart grid plays out in practice. And in the U.S. in 2009 with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act after the kind of market crash, they've had, I think it's $4.2 billion investment in smart meters. But there were no standards as to how they'd be consistent. There were no agreements as to what data they would collect, what they would share, what the promise was to the consumer. So smart grid is a term that can be quite variably interpreted depending on who you are and what you want to do with it. So the answer is yes. Any other questions or comments? Or, you know, and I do want to say as well, the rural cooperatives have been some of the highest penetration of smart meters, in part because they have so few customers per line. Actually, reading the meters was very, very challenging because, you know, you had to send someone out to read them. So it made sense for them to invest in that remote reading infrastructure earlier rather than later.
My name is Loya Hassan. I'm a mechanical engineering student. I'm a senior. And my question is, looking at the energy transition in the Arab world and how the Arab world is dependent on fossil fuels and for the revenues, what do you think about the integration between the renewable energy and developing the technology for current for keeping the fossil fuels in the energy mix? What do you think about developing the technology of already fossil oil power generation and integrating renewable energies within it?
I think, you know, one of the things I really appreciated when I started working in the U.S. was how every state had a really different energy story, depending on what resources they had, what natural resources they had, what the legacy energy system was, what the political constituents were. And I would posit, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, that across the Arab world, you also have a huge diversity in legacy energy systems, in natural resources, in politics, in institutional capabilities that are allowing for very different levels and very different answers to that question that you just asked. I was in Saudi Arabia a few years ago, and one of the things that I appreciated was their development of solar was because they right now use 30% of all the oil they produce in the electric sector. So they're deploying solar widely, but it was so they could export more oil. That's not going to be the case in places that don't have the oil resources, of course. And so I think one of the interesting things that I've appreciated here is how the layered, is that a nice way to say it? The layered energy system from the traditional state actors to your informal power providers offer potentially different types of opportunities depending on where you are. But could you do it? Do you have control systems that allow this type of integration? Are you able to ramp? Are you not able to ramp? I mean, there's really interesting question sets that I think are going to be answered very differently in very different parts of the Arab world. And I mean, you guys being part of this is pretty exciting. Where do you see the opportunities?
As you said, there's the deficiency in the infrastructure in Lebanon. So ramping up, as you said, the integration between both energies is something like in Lebanon. There's the net metering for the privately consumed private users for energy. So we have to work on the infrastructure, in my opinion.
It's a little bit different. I mean, remember that net metering was a policy that was developed to fill a gap between the commercial viability of solar and and what the market price was. From what I understood and what people are paying in the informal power sector here, there really isn't a financial gap between the cost of solar and what you're paying now. And so for me, I often wonder if there's other sorts of technology choices or policy choices that may be more complementary to your system here. In the US, because of net metering, they don't allow, let's say we have a building, they don't allow you to install more solar than is used by that building itself. Right? If I own a little shopping center and put solar on the roof, I can't oversupply. But really, from an energy transition perspective, you want me to be producing as much as I possibly can of low-income power. But because we've structured our policy incentives in a way where the utility has to pay me oftentimes retail or real-time rates, they have no incentive for letting me do so. So I think we're at a stage in many parts of the world where rethinking some of these policy arrangements might be really fruitful.
Hello, Jad Baba. Graduated from AUB with the energy studies. I just want to ask about why do utilities look at community shared solar differently than single home ownership of solar, something that you touched upon? I want to know more about this.
I thought this was really interesting as well. When we first started going to the co-ops and unis, they were often saying, well, what's your name? If Mazen puts solar on his roof, then I have to pay for the backup power. Then while he's investing in his roof, I have to pay for this interconnection, this protection. He's going to cost all of us a lot of money. We basically, as a community, have to subsidize his energy choice. And they also didn't want to lose their customers. But if we as a utility, as a community, collectively invest in a community solar plant where everyone has an equal opportunity, again, this concept of equality, to put the resources in and develop the resources, then it becomes something that we share and we manage together. And that idea of fairness that was so strong came from the richest members of the community being able to self-supply and protect their own power to a community solution that lets us all benefit from this resource. It fit philosophically into how they thought about what their job was as a utility to supply energy to their company, to their community at the lowest price in a reliable fashion. And I hadn't appreciated before that configuration would have such an important, almost allergic reaction. But it has become this idea that if individual rooftops are doing it, it costs more to the system than if I'm able to manage and control it remotely. From the grid operator's perspective as well, I can decide where in the distribution network it goes. I can decide, how to remotely control it or not. Whereas if I have the need for 50 different control systems, it will cost me more. And actually, I wondered here in Lebanon, we were talking about this earlier, what is the unit of analysis? Should it be a big high-rise building? Should it be a community? I mean, are there different kind of scales that you would want to think about when you're thinking about your energy systems? I know many of you are interested in the renewable space.
Hello, I'm Karim Abdo, first year mechanical engineering. My question is, in 2017, there was a plan called Drawdown that included 100 solutions to actually reverse global warming. And it proved that it was actually economically viable. But why aren't governments and industries actually, what pushed them back into getting into this project? What's holding them back?
Inertia is a powerful force.
Excuse me?
Inertia is a powerful force. And politically, making changes in different parts of the world happen really differently. One of the reasons I think it's so interesting to come here is to hear how the technologies exist, but actually implementing solutions really falls often on weak institutions and the lack, from what I understood, of political will to get things done. A solution has to fit where you're applying it, and you have to have the political will to go forward. In 2009, 2010, I lived in Beijing. I was in China. And what was so interesting there was how rapidly things happened. Right? I mean, the year I was there in Beijing, they were putting in 75 kilometers of new metro. And it took, I think we were building in the town I was living in at the US at the time, like a kilometer a year, right? I mean, it's just like that scale of change in different parts of the world is really phenomenal. I mean, this is the challenge of your generation, let's be honest.
Hi, my name is Antonius Shadid. I'm a second-year mechanical engineer. My question for you is, your field is basically at the intersection of the technical world and policy. So do you think that it's a problem that sometimes policymakers don't understand the technical aspect of whatever it is, say energy in our case?
Yes, and I also think it's a problem that the technical people don't understand the policy process. Or the really other kind of embedded places that we go forward. To have the answer and not understand the process or how to get to the solution is just as weak as to not understand how the system works. And, you know, I mean, they have to fit together. I mean, one of the things I think that's so interesting, if you think about students that work in energy across this world, it's like you guys need to be cross-trained. You need to understand the technology, you need to understand the finance piece, you need to understand the laws and the regulations, but you also need to know how to get stuff done. And you need to be institutional ninjas of the energy sector. Like, what does that look like? What does that look like going forward? What does that look like at different scales? I mean, it's a huge opportunity, but it's really hard to do in practice. There were some beautiful maps that the American Electric Power, AEP, is one of the biggest utilities in the US. They would put out with this beautiful HVDC grid going across the country. And some of the utility planners were like, oh yeah, this is what an engineer would do. But, you know, to actually do it in practice means that you have to talk to, you know, every single PUC, every single county commissioner to, you know, get the approvals to build the lines to do this. So sometimes the solutions are so obvious and absolutely impossible given today's system. So it's not only figuring out what is optimal, but also what is possible. And they often say that politics is the art of the possible. So how do you balance the technological potential with the political possible, and where that space exists in between differs really depending on where you are. One of the pieces, and I think I missed it when I was talking afterwards. Here it is. This is the Cooperative Utilities. And this is from a conversation we were having yesterday, have really been active, and maybe this goes to the smart grid question a little bit, but they've really been active in demand management for decades. Before it was fancy, before you had smart grids, they were cycling your electric water heater, they were cycling your air conditioning system, just your kind of very simple control signals. But this idea of demand management as being part of this conversation is pretty interesting as well. Interruptible commercial industrial load, different types of irrigation and how that was managed as well. So this demand management piece was really powerful for them because their charges were based on a demand charge. So the more they used at one time, that's what determined kind of their demand charge going forward. Again, how those rates are structured, what technologies make sense, where you can find those little needles to thread. Any other questions, conversations? This is only my second time here, but every time I come, I leave with a whole set of questions that go beyond the technologies, that really make me think differently about institutions, about solutions that bridge the formal sector, the informal sector, how the informal sector becomes formalized through metering, through rate structures. I mean, this is really a place where there's all kinds of creative solutions happening in the face of some real hardship. And so I think it's that creative solution space which we can all learn a lot from.
because part of finding solutions is understanding the demand, doing the data monitoring, and so on. And I kept for the past week listening in the training about the data security and the frustration of the professors of not getting the data that they are collecting from houses and so on due to data privacy. So this is something also is a constraint for especially our region. Imagine if you're doing, the smart metering, when people are in or out, when you can go and steal their houses, when they are on travel. So how is this data security issue dealt with? Then from the use, you can tell lots of things about what people are doing.
It's true, and the level of metering, if it's plug load metering, it's very different than if it's whole house metering. I sometimes wonder if our concentration on residential smart metering is often misguided. If I'm thinking about the whole electricity sector, and I have a 4 to 20 megawatt customer versus all of you in your individual homes, one smart meter, you can get 80% of the benefits, right, by concentrating on 20% of the customers. And in some ways, I think our policy in the U.S. of kind of providing smart meters for all was a meter sales policy, much more so than kind of the utilitarian, why are we doing this? What are the real benefits for our system? And really, what are the real benefits for our consumers? I mean, if you're thinking about having electric vehicle charging or integrating solar into your house or being part of a mini grid in your community, that's one thing. But if you're just thinking about, billing people differently, the research that's been coming out on prices and people's behavior is actually not that promising. And so I think it's a really good question. That said, I have to say with social media, people share a lot more personal information relatively freely or not than kilowatt hours per month. And that you can also figure out if someone is home if you go to their house. And so, some of the fears of privacy, I wonder also if they're not kind of trumped up by the utilities to keep control of those data. Because I often think that as a society, we're investing hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies for the energy system. And there needs to also be some sort of accountability and evaluation of, are these programs working? And these data are a really important part of this kind of demand side story as well. What they've been doing in the US is the utilities have been holding those data and not wanting to share them or sharing them with small groups with memoranda of understanding. That said, there's a utility, I don't have a picture of it up here, a lot of the municipal utilities just have the data up on their website. And people don't really care, it seems. And we've kind of made it a big deal, but they had the data up of your natural gas use, your electric use, and your water use. And I also want to say that regularly in the U.S., for water, for example, we do what's called social shaming. Austin, Texas had an article about Lance Armstrong, remember the cyclist, who used a lot of water in his mansion. And it was on, the front page of the paper that he was a water hog. And regularly utilities, and they need to save water, will publish, your 10 names to, make you use less water. Shamed, users of water, but not of energy. I don't know why. Why is it okay water use and not your electricity use? We can talk about that some other time. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ahmad. I'm an AUB grad. Thank you so much for the talk. Thank you for the talk so much. I just wanted to ask, I don't know how much you know about our local context. Can you share with us what do you think are important high-level policies, and what are important technical or political or, I don't know, points that we have that we can leverage in Lebanon to enhance or speed up the transition to a better, more effective power sector and energy system overall. Like, what's your take on what you saw in Lebanon? How do you think is the best way forward? High-level points, if you have.
I think the experts are sitting right over here in this room. It's what? By fewer SUVs, is that the point? This is something that people are struggling with all over the world, right? And the shape of the Lebanese struggle, for me, what I appreciate is that in theory, there's beautiful laws on the books. Practice is harder, right? And so thinking about how the institutions and how things work in practice is really important. And so I don't know how, as a civil society, you decide to strengthen institutions. I mean, it seems like an impossible task. And over here, you have people that have worked in the utility. What is your collective years in the utility, gentlemen? 35, 40 years together? Yeah. How many years have you worked on the electric power grid in... Yeah. Here you have a century and a half of experience of trying to answer your question. And I don't know. I mean, but I would argue actually that of those 4 billion people on the planet, a lot of them live in situations much more like Lebanon than Denmark, right? Where you struggle with the institutions, where you struggle with the finance, where you struggle with actually making things work. And so if there was an easy answer, I think we would have done it. I think you would have done it. Or the gentleman over here with their 157 years of collective power system experience. This is hard stuff. And in practice, it's really tricky. Like, we can have the solutions, we can make the models, we can do the Excel spreadsheets, but actually doing the work's tough. That, I guess, was my question about scale. Are there scale solutions for communities, for buildings, where you may be able to get a little bit of traction?
Thank you. I was trying maybe to hint at something. Maybe
you have the answer.
No, no one has the answer. Bas, basically, you've been all over the world. You've seen a lot of people do different stuff. I was just trying to hint at maybe we can leverage our distributed diesel generation issues and make use of that in a way, because it's already there, it's working. That's.
And I think also, in some ways, you've already broken the monopoly, right? A lot of places can't do anything because there's a power sector monopoly. Here, it's already been broken. Can you get your diesel? Well, but now you have an informal sector that plays an important role. And can that informal sector go from diesel gensets to also thinking about other types of technologies that may be economic?
They started to do that, by the way.
Really?
Yeah.
Where about? What is the experiment there? Tell me about it.
Few municipalities are actually incorporating solar energy within their diesel network. Some are actually even thinking of storage, battery storage. Yeah, but it's a bottom-up approach. So an investor actually approaches the municipality and tries to sell them the solution.
I think the story of finance and technology and opportunity looks different everywhere in the world, but I think that institutional, we can call it that, may also be an opportunity in some ways too. I mean, when you think about the market-based solution in the U.S. right now, we're in love with market-based solutions. It never really has worked well for the bottom 20% of the population, right? I mean, we always have this place of energy poverty where we say people are choosing food or fuel. And oftentimes in the U.S., we've used that as an excuse to not change our system. We can't afford to change it because there are poor people, as opposed to creating policies to help people with their bills or insulate their homes or do things like that. So everywhere in the world, you have different configurations that kind of trigger opportunities for action or for not doing anything. And for me, one of the reasons why these consumer-owned utilities were so interesting was because in theory, they represented the interests of the people. And many of the people wanted their energy systems to look quite different. But in practice, there's just such a huge variation where some of them were really trying to create this energy system of the future, and others were fighting their hardest to keep their 46 diesel genset operational. So I guess at the end of the day, it's energy systems, but it's people making decisions within the energy systems to validate their own ideas of how the world works. Right?
So do you think we should try to target the people and not the energy system? Maybe, I don't know, maybe introduce some new ideologies.
That's why you're here, right?
So much.
Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate your coming and spending a little bit of time with us on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon.